contradiction. I grew up in the Caribbean, and I've revisited the Caribbean, where color is a joy, where it sings from the houses and the shacks and the landscape, and it's not, no one's afraid of it. It's used to uplift and to make very simple, quite basic living standards, maybe much more vibrant and uplifting and joyous. The climate helps, of course. Now, I also have this British side where palettes are much more muted and subtle, and I'm looking out the window now and it's pretty grey, but there are some beautiful, beautiful soft greens and greys out there, which I also love.
I'm Bob Acton, and I'm pleased to share with you a conversation with Su Jameson, a sculptor based in the UK. Her work on people and their stories is the focus of her explorations using hand-built ceramics. Both her expressionist figurative forms and her surface decorations are just amazing. And she and I have a conversation about color, surface design, form, and the need to listen to your heart. If you want to follow her, you'll see links to her website and Instagram accounts in the show notes.
Welcome to Color and Ceramics, the podcast for ceramic artists who want valuable ideas about using color from leading artists and world-class experts. Here's your host, Bob Acton, a sculptor and ceramic artist who's fascinated with color and how potters, sculptors, and artists use color in their work. Tune in as he talks with his guests about color, techniques, and the impact of color on people and art itself.
Su, welcome to the Color and Ceramics podcast to talk about color and surface decoration. I'm very excited about you being here because I love your work, and you make beautiful, wonderful sculptures and use brilliant colors and gorgeous surface design. And so welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Bob. What lovely introduction. And I am an interesting one when it comes to color, because I think color is something I fight with in the rest of my life. But in ceramics, I really enjoy playing with it and having fun with it. I'm an awful interior designer. I'm an awful painter. But when I come to making 3D pieces, I really enjoy that added bit of color at the end for me. Some ceramicists I know put the color in to the clay, for example, or they might put the color in the process, but I build something and then I have a huge amount of fun throwing color at it.
Nice. Excellent. Could you maybe start off a little bit by telling us about your journey, like a little bit about you and your work and what got you to here in terms of your journey with clay?
Okay. So I was born in Trinidad, and I spent my formative years in a very colourful, vibrant culture. And I then came back to England for my later schooling life, and I went to university. And then after university, I decided I needed to go to art school. So I did a postgraduate sculpture year, which was when I learnt about the figure and modelling. But I then worked mostly as a modeler and caster. So I had some time in London when I was working in a cooperative studio, and there was a big group of us. So we would all work together, making quite large scale figurative pieces or stone carvings, whatever it might have been. And I then would cast in bronze very occasionally, but mostly in cement fondue or plaster or resin. But I had a team around me to help me with that. And I then moved into teaching and started teaching in universities and then into schools when I had my own family. And then when I decided that I wanted to return to my own practice, I didn't have this big group of artists around me in a community studio. I just had my little shed at the bottom of the garden. So I decided that ceramics might be an interesting new discipline to learn, to keep me engaged and to turn me back into a learner, having been a teacher for many, many years. And also it was physically something I could manage on my own. And it's proven to be both fascinating and challenging and frustrating in equal measure. I know you're a new ceramicist, aren't you, Bob? And you've been learning as well. So although I was trained in clay, I was never trained to keep the clay. The clay was a byproduct, it was a waste material. So I've had to retrain my brain to really treasure the clay and treat it like a close relative, really. Nurture it and care for it, and hope that it behaves itself in the firings and the drying processes. And so it's been a massive learning curve, but I've really, really enjoyed the challenge. And yeah, I still believe I have a huge amount to learn. I'm not a chemist either, so I find the whole glazing, chemical side of it quite daunting. So I found a system that suits me, which is mostly using 1 or 2 clays, coloured slips, firing high to stoneware, and then maybe occasionally glazing.
It is complicated, isn't it? I've had my hand in other crafty kinds of things, particularly with wood, and I've found clay to be far more complex with the chemical compositions that you're talking about, the interactions with heat and temperature and surfaces. Like, it's amazingly complex. You have to have a lot of patience.
You do, and I feel you also have to have quite an ordered mind, which I do not. So I approach my ceramics more like a piece of fine art, intuitive work. It's not often highly planned. It's I'm not very good at record keeping, so every piece is a one-off. I can't reproduce anything, but I quite like that. I don't like people have advised me in the profession to find a style and stick to it, and get known for a certain type of work, and that's never really, I mean, I think it happens anyway because you make what you make and you are a certain person, but I find it difficult to repeat things.
Now,
And
I would find that a bit boring to make the same thing over
yes,
and over again. Is that true for you?
yes, indeed, yes. And every time I think I'm going to do something, it turns into something else. But that's what I love about the creative process, is that you never quite know where it's going to go, and that's the thrill of it. And if I was a little bit more scientific about it, then maybe I could produce really exquisitely delicate, finely formed pieces, but that's just not the person I am. So it wouldn't really be true to me. I'm much more of I treat the clay in quite a raw way. I keep it quite rough. I'm now at the moment using crank clay because it's got a bit more grog in it, and it allows me to be even more inventive with how I build my structures, trying to break the structures up a bit, just keeping myself on my toes, never quite sure where I'm going. Is for me much more exciting than having a set plan.
Yeah, very cool. And so when you're talking about sculptors needing to be a bit ordered, did you mean that you think that you've been advised anyway that sculptors should have a specific plan in place and keep records and all the things that you were talking about?
Not sculptors so much, but ceramicists.
Yeah.
So the ceramic process, the use of glazes, the use of chemicals to make those glazes, the use of oxides. If you keep really meticulous records, then you can almost repeat a favored glaze or a favored look, or but I'll come across, things will happen in the kiln and it'll be amazing and I'll love it, or it'll be a disaster and I'll hate it, in which case I will rework something many times. um, so it's not a commercially viable way of working. I might fire something 5 or 6 times in order to get it speaking to me, but I don't know when it's going to speak to me. I don't have a set idea of, oh, I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, then I'm going to. It's much more intuitive and much more. I do something, it speaks back to me. I don't like it, so I change it. It speaks back to me again. So it's a dialogue, quite a feisty dialogue at times. And sometimes the piece is finished. I don't like it. It'll sit on the shelf for a couple of years, and then I'll suddenly think I've fallen back in like with it.
Yeah.
And I'll have another go, which I know is against all the rules, but I love that. I don't want to obey rules particularly.
Yeah, you've said that before. What is it about falling in love with a piece that you made 2 years ago against the rules?
Oh, the ceramic rules, in that you're not supposed to refire things and add things on top. And there are purists. Well, this is certainly what I've read. There are purist ceramic principles that one is encouraged to follow when learning. However, I know that the ancient masters and have always done things in different ways, and that's how things evolve and change, right? That's how porcelain probably was invented, was by somebody breaking a rule somewhere and finding a different way to do something. So I think it's maybe comes from my quite traditional art school training. When I wasn't a ceramicist at all, I wasn't learning these things. So ceramics is purely self-taught. But I did go to art school and I did learn to draw, and I did learn to use clay to model the figure. And I just enjoy not following some of the more specific things I was told. Having said that, I'm now contradicting myself terribly because personally, I love abstract art, but every time I make clay, it comes out figurative. And I can't break that cycle.
It's interesting, isn't it, how we make
How
a
about you,
piece?
Bob?
Well, it's interesting. I guess I've tried all sorts of different techniques and different things, and what I'm finding I'm doing is now combining them. And I think, like you, I'm finding what works. Not so much about whether it follows a rule or not, about whether it works in the studio. And I think for the sculptural work that I'm more focused on these days, and you certainly are, we don't have to worry about food safety and those kinds of things that the functional folks. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Hey, you said you've gone to school and you've now taken this intuitive approach to your sculptures, and you're self-taught on these things. How did you learn about colors and surface design? Because that's really a key part of your work.
That, I think, came from being a teacher for many, many years and just enjoying finding different ways to engage children, mostly for me, older children. So I mostly taught young adults and teenagers how to engage them and just to enjoy color and texture and design and find a way to express something, how they're feeling or what they think about something through this visual medium. And as a teacher, I would play a lot. I think play is hugely important. And so that fueled many of my processes in terms of whether I sgraffito something or whether I apply thick slips and then I pull it off and scrape it off again. And that all very much comes from, it wasn't how I was taught at all, but I think it was more how I taught in terms of keeping a piece of work alive by changing it constantly changing it and reworking. And I think the color principles are emotionally driven. Mm-hmm. So I'll choose colors for emotional reasons rather than, oh, that goes with that. So my color wheel is less formal than one you might see in an art book. It's much more what colors are speaking to me at that particular time in my life. And that might be a result of a trip or something I see in nature or something I'm feeling on the inside.
Mm. So tell us a bit more about that. That's like you've talked about your approach being quite intuitive, and that story of color sort of feels the same. How does that play itself out into terms of, what you might select when you're applying a slip to your piece? Why pink versus yellow, as an example?
Well, it might be pink and yellow.
Yes.
um, okay, I think I'm a contradiction. I grew up in the Caribbean, and I've revisited the Caribbean, where color is a joy, where it sings from the houses and the shacks and the landscape, and it's not, no one's afraid of it. It's used to uplift and to make very simple, quite basic living standards maybe much more vibrant and uplifting and joyous. The climate helps, of course. Now, I also have this British side where palettes are much more muted and subtle, and I'm looking out the window now and it's pretty grey, but there are some beautiful, beautiful soft greens and greys out there, which I also love. So I think for many years that palette was dominant, and then I, for example, went back to the Caribbean and these colors were just singing at me, and I thought I've got to use those again and get re-engaged with my younger self and what I used to love about that. And then I just really enjoyed doing it. I really loved seeing these colors that really shouldn't be sitting next to each other, having a lovely time doing so. And also I think it's really important, and you'll know this well, is that when you're using the slips, they don't look like they're going to look when they're fired. So it's all a little bit of a mystery game, and you do it in the hopes that you're going to get the zing that you're after. But until you fired the piece, you don't quite know. And which is why when I said before I might fire it a few times, because the zing isn't quite there, or I'm a lover of subtlety as well, so that there might be a real nuanced shift from grey to green that isn't there, and I just notch up the temperature a little bit and it'll start to come out. Or equally, I might have gone too high. So there's a lot there that I'm still discovering about color. And the red, as you probably know, is a really difficult thing to achieve in the ceramic world. So that is still a mission. I don't use a lot of red because it is so hard to get it. It often comes out as a rust or as a brown, but just that really bright red is very difficult. Certainly at stoneware, I think you can get them at lower temperatures using earthenwares, but I don't do that. And why I don't do that, I'm not sure. I just kind of ended up in the stoneware world. And yeah, I'm not sure why that came about. I think it was due to the clays that I was using that needed to be fired pretty high. And I'm absolutely in love with this black clay that I use, which does fire high.
How high?
So I'm firing it at about 1260, but it'll go up to 14.
There's a real sense of, when I look at your pieces, that of this contrast, this kind of juxtaposition between the dark, rough clay and the smooth, bright colors. I mean, personally, I like that. What is it that you're trying to achieve with that contrast in each piece?
That's a good question. I don't want to overly hide the surface. I don't want to dress the sculpture too much because I love the raw clay in itself and I find it very expressive just on its own. And many, many times I've thought, right, leave this one, don't paint, don't slip this one. And I do have pieces that are darker than others, but I just find that, I guess it's a type of, oh gosh, I'm trying to find the right words. Why do I do it? What am I looking for in that contrast? I'm trying, well, all I can tell you is I'm trying to make work that evokes something in the viewer. Mm-hmm. I'm not really making it to put on my own shelves and look at for the rest of time. I have to get something out of me. What that is changes each time I walk in the studio. I need to get something out of me. I find that I can get it out of me by making ceramic sculptures. Okay. And I really hope that whatever I make has some impact on someone else one day somewhere in the world. I'm not particularly aware who my audience is. I just know that the way that I put my work out and it goes, one day someone finds it and it works for them. And that may take a day, that may take a year. But so the use of the color against that deep black clay is, I suppose, that juxtaposition I was talking about earlier between something very muted in my thinking and something really quite crazy and wacky and out there. And I'm a bit of a contradictory person, maybe, and that comes out. But I really don't want the work to look too disjointed or too chaotic. I need it to work as a whole. And I'm not sure I'm there yet. That's what I keep working at. That's my challenge, is for the surface not to look like a surface, but for it to look part of the piece. Mm-hmm. How it should be, that it belongs there.
Yeah, you said you use slips, and so I assume that you're using slips with stains in them to get the colors you're after. Do you ever play around with underglazes at all?
I have. I find them a bit, I don't find the quality of the color quite as I would like. So they very much are underglazes for me. So they might sit 4 layers under something. Very rarely will they find their way to the surface. I use a lot of oxides, and that affects the slips in various ways, quite exciting ways. But no, the colored slips, I really like the way I can mix that almost like a palette. And I sort of almost mix them as I put them on sometimes. Yeah. I find it a very much freer process, and the quality of the color is good for me anyway. Yeah. I don't like shiny surfaces for some reason. Yeah. I love that matte quality. I almost want the color to look like it's coming out of the clay itself. And maybe that's something I could investigate in the future in actually putting the pigment in the clay. I've seen people do that.
Yeah, that would be a challenge with the clay that you're using, because it's pretty dark, right? You'd get
it's very dark.
Yeah, you'd get a muted kind of color maybe in some ways, right?
I think the reason I like that dark clay is because it creates a depth to the underlying structure. And so if you're using lighter clays, I often find that the light just bounces off the top, whereas with this deep clay, the light really, the darkness is really dark, and the shadows that it creates are intense.
It really comes through the slips and the oxides, as opposed to white clay, which is the opposite. It doesn't come through at all, and so you see more of the surface. with the white.
Yes, and I think that's, sorry, a very roundabout way. I think we've got there, Bob, with your help, that I like the color, the clay to come through underneath the color and the color to be part of the clay rather than having a piece of clay that is painted over the top of.
Yeah.
I want the two materials to work together as if they're part of each other.
Now, how do you think your choice of color influences the overall mood of the piece or the message that you want to get across to your buyers?
I seem to go in waves, and when I've made a collection, and I tend to work in collections, so I'll work on maybe 10, 12 pieces at a time. They will have not a totally replicated color scheme, but they will have similarities of color coming through them. And often, if I've had a collection which is full of very clashing, bright, vibrant colors, my next kind of group of works can come from me in a calmer way. So they may be more muted palette or a more restricted palette. The emotions are individual to each piece, and I don't think the color alone does that. I think there is a lot in the expressions that I try to create, and those will change all the way through the making of the piece. And so, again, a bit like when I was saying earlier about when something starts to speak to me, it's to do with the colors, but it's also very much to do with that expression. And the colors may actually work with that emotion, or they may fight against it. But sometimes I quite like that fight because it's unexpected. Mm-hmm. You see this bright pink and orange piece of work and you expect it to be one thing, but as you get closer and you start to engage with the detail of it, it turns into something very different. Mm-hmm. And it kind of takes you on an emotional journey. I don't want everything to be exactly what it looks like it's going to be from the off. But that is not intentional. As I said, it's just how it evolves in the making process because I change these things all the time.
It's like you and the piece are having a dance together. And in some ways, you know, yes. You put your left foot forward and they put their right foot back, and you have to work together on that piece. And I was going to ask you about balancing form with surface design, because I remember when I was taking my first ceramics classes many, many years ago, my first teacher talked about form, and form was the answer for everything, and that was primary. And your forms are very unique, figurative pieces that sort of, in some ways, make me think of soldiers. I don't know why I think that when I see your latest pieces. So how do you think about form along with the color or the surface?
Okay, that's a great question, and it provokes a little anxiety in me because I had a crit once, not so long ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, from what one would deem to be a highly regarded art academic, whose crit was that the form and the form should dominate. The form should be for everything, and that the more and more you add to the surface, the less the form can speak. And the crit, I guess, was I needed to reduce what I was doing to the surface in order for the form to come through. And a little bit of me is still looking into that and thinking, okay, yes, that's fair enough. And I might sometimes get right to the end of a piece and just pour a huge amount of oxide over it in order to just limit some areas from that busy colored surface. But, however, I think that the form is quite simple in most of my pieces, and I'm not trying to make a highly intricate, detailed sculpture, and so therefore the surface textures and the things I scratch into it and the things I write into it can all be discovered on closer inspection. I hope that you kind of meet the piece several times. You meet it from afar, and then as you meet it physically closer, but also as you get to know it and you live with it, you meet it closer still. However, as a sculpture, my original training was as a sculptor. I would agree that the form needs to be the dominant aesthetic. And I guess that's my challenge. I'm still working on that. I'm still learning about how much I want to let the joy and fun I have with the color and the surface and the patterns, and how much I want that to disappear in order for this form to come through. And actually, the pieces I'm working on at the moment, the form is much more broken up. So it is more complicated, and it may be that as a result of that, I have to let the overall color and surface treatment of the piece be much more pared back. Because I think if I've got all of it going on, then that might be too much. But I will see. I will try it out.
Yeah, very good.
Did I answer your question?
Yes, I think
I'm not
so.
sure I did.
I think so. I mean, I think I hear you saying that your pieces really beg some inspection in some ways. So you can see them, the form from afar, and of course the colors catch your eye. But also people need to get up close, and they need to see the little pieces that you put in there, the little writings. And in some ways I feel like you want to come over and touch them, because really they beg to be touched in lots of ways, don't they?
Yes, I love for work to be touched. I would hate to have that preciousness one can often associate with a ceramic piece, because it is a breakable material. It's not like a bronze. But I would love to be making work that people feel confident to touch and pick up and handle. And in many ways, the things I love about pieces of work that I look at and respond to from others that other people are making is when I have to look again and again and again, and each time I find a little extra something behind. So the endless layering of colors and patterns and whatever it might be that is interesting me in that particular collection. And it may be lost under a final coat of something, but I know it's there.
Yeah. And
I hope that somehow the viewer will know it's there. Sorry, Bob, I've gone really dark, haven't I?
It's okay. It's all right.
So I really hope that the even the things that can't be seen are still coming through in some way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know,
the underpainting.
Yeah, for sure. There's like even some little secrets in there sometimes that you might put in that they get covered up, that you know are there, that nobody else is there, and it brings you a little pleasure seeing that piece and knowing that it's in that sculpture, and somebody might catch it in a bit of a surprise, or maybe not even quite understand the meaning of it in some ways.
Yes, and I think often when I work with galleries, which I tend to do rather than selling directly, because I'm not a very good salesperson. But the gallery always wants to know quite a lot about the piece. And obviously titles are very powerful things in how much you say, how much you don't say. I've always been very fascinated, sometimes very frustrated, when you walk up to this amazing piece of work and it's untitled, and it's leaving all the work to you. So I do love to give a little clue. I influenced a lot by poetry and what, like we were discussing earlier, the heard word, audio, plays, stories, things that I might be listening to. And so sometimes a title might be suggested, but also I like the idea that the title might be in the piece itself, because a piece of sculpture doesn't hang on a wall with a nice little notice next to it. It has to stand on its own. So often the title is in there somewhere. It's written in there, scratched in there, which I quite like. Even if it's invisible by the end, it's in there somewhere.
Very cool. You know, you've got some great ideas here, and I think our audience will be really fascinated with your approach to things. And I'm sitting here reflecting on the fact that you've been a teacher for many years. And so, have you got any advice for a budding ceramic artist, or maybe a sculptor who's changing their approach, or like what advice would you have them about developing their own unique style?
Make what you make. Don't worry about what everyone else is making. Try not to look too much out, look in, because you will never create uniqueness. You will only stumble across it, because if you try and do it, if you try and be unique, you won't be. But if it just comes from a very honest, genuine place where you are just making what you make, that will be unique, because it is coming from yourself and you are an individual person. I see so much out there that seems to be trying to emulate a particular wave or style or type of work, whether that be to do with fashion or to do with popularity. You're never gonna, well, this is just my thinking, you're never gonna catch that if you force it. It has to just happen from your own personal motivation and direction. And if people don't like it, they don't like it. It really doesn't matter. If it's speaking to you and you feel you have something relevant to say, then someone else out there, one day, somewhere, will get it. And that, as I said before, that may take a day, it may take a year, it may take 10 years. However, this viewpoint doesn't necessarily give you a strong commercial basis for your work. So I wouldn't say that I'm great on that at all. I do sell my work. It gives me great pleasure to find people who want to find a place for it in their world. But the reason I make it is not that.
Yeah.
The reason I make it is because I have to make it, for whatever reason that might be. And if there are long spells where I don't make, I feel really quite extraordinarily strange. But I keep returning to making it. So there must be something there that is happening for me in the process. And if someone else can share in that and get something from it, then that gives me huge pleasure. So my advice to anyone wanting to change or learn is to try not to be too afraid, try not to worry about mistakes or getting things wrong, and try not to make work that you see other people making, because you'll only ever be a lesser version of them. You have to be the best version of yourself.
There's an element, I think, it's certainly been true for me as I've learned to let go of worrying about whether somebody will like it or not, or whether somebody will buy it or not, has been a sense of introspection, and to be able to be aware of that little voice in me around what it is that I'm liking, and to honor that, I guess. Does that fit for what you're talking about?
Absolutely. You have to trust yourself. You have to trust your own inner voice that you referred to then. And critics will like it or loathe it. But that's their perception. If you're worried about critique, you're in the wrong game. I think it can be very hurtful and harsh, but you're always going to learn from it. And that's just going to make your work stronger, whether it be because you reject the critique or you think, oh, actually, I could learn something from this. So humility is very important as well, I think, when you're learning a craft. Always feel like you have more to learn. Never feel like you've got there. If you've got there, then why make any more? The whole reason we just keep making and making and making is because we're still trying to work it out. And so the day you feel you've worked it all out is probably when you need to move on to something else, because it's that hunger and that desire for learning that keeps the work fresh and alive and relevant. On a bad day, Bob, I will admit, I think, what am I doing? I'm just making more landfill for the world. Then I have to give myself a little bit of space and time.
Yeah.
And I then realize that, oh, I have got something I want to say. I just happen to have chosen this form to say it in.
Yeah.
And that has relevance. And I need to have confidence that I am entitled to say it, whatever it may be. And even if it's only for myself, I still have that human gift of being able to communicate in so many different ways, whether it be a written piece of work or a three-dimensional piece of work. I don't know. I just don't have another way I can say it. Yeah. So I do have to do this. I don't really feel there's a choice.
And really, there are some people who will love your work and lots of people who will not, right? And
absolutely.
And it's about finding a way to connect with people who love it and listen to. I was at a show recently, and within minutes, I had a couple of people walk by. One young woman stood in the hallway at this big art show and pointed at one of my pieces and said, "Oh, that's nightmare food." And I kind of laughed at that, right? But it was interesting because it produced an emotional reaction in her, which I thought was really interesting. And minutes later, somebody else came by, looked at the same piece and went, "Oh, my God, I just love this." So it's really interesting to see how people respond to our work, and for us to not get, but to listen to it, but not get too wrapped up in it, because then all we end up doing is trying to please somebody else.
Yes, and that's no way to be. I think the contradiction or the difficult thing I'm now going to say is that even though we're having a conversation about this very subject, and that this is for other people's interest, and I'd be delighted if other people are interested, quite understand if they're not, but delighted if they are. However, my advice would be try not to look out. I did say this before, look out too much, because I think the world we live in at the moment is so full of visual information, what everybody else is doing, what everyone else is making. And although that can be just an amazing resource, phenomenal to find out what, for example, how would I ever have known what you were doing all that way over on the other side of the world? So that side of it is fabulous, but don't let it make you feel overwhelmed by what everyone else is doing, and that you need to do that too. You just need to do what you do. And I keep having to remind myself of this, because as your experience shows, people are going to walk past and love it, and then another person's going to walk past and hate it.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely fine by me. I just have to make what I have to make. And if anyone else is interested, then that's a bonus.
That's really great advice to really end our conversation on, Sue. I hope that people will have found our conversation to be interesting and learned some technical things like slips and oxides and so on that they might then begin to apply to their work if that interests them. But really, at the same time, you really have to honor yourself and your own emotional space inside about what it is that you want to do. So thanks so much for being with us here today, Sue. I really appreciate you spending your time here today having this conversation.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Bob. It's been a pleasure to finally see you and have a chat with you. Keep working, and I look forward to seeing all the new things you're going to make next year.
Cool.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're most welcome.
Thanks for listening to the Color and Ceramics podcast with Bob Acton and his guests. Please help others find the podcast by subscribing to this podcast wherever you find your podcasts, such as iTunes, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube, or other podcatchers. And don't forget to give us a review. We'll see you next time.